Hello and welcome to the Ruth MacFit podcast, where we chat all things health, fitness, nutrition, and how to build habits that actually work with your life. Now, if you're enjoying these episodes, then it really helps if you like and you subscribe. And I absolutely love hearing from you. So please do leave a comment, maybe a 5-star review, and let me know what has resonated with you. Right, let's get into today's episode. Hello, welcome back. Always very happy to be here and chatting to you. And today I'm going to be going back to my traditional format of talking about one more specific topic. And this one came about after a conversation that I had recently with a very lovely woman who was telling me that she eats incredibly healthily. In fact, I would go so far as to say that she's pretty adverse to the more ultra processed foods and avoids them as much as possible. She cooks at home, she prioritizes whole foods as much as possible, but she still isn't losing weight. And this got me thinking about how there are two things that I come across again and again as questions with regards to fat loss and nutrition. One of them is I know what to eat. I know what healthy food looks like. So why do I struggle to do it? And another one is I eat really healthily. So why am I still not losing weight? And if either of those thoughts have ever crossed your mind, then I want to just say straight away before we even begin that you are not alone. This is something that I come across again and again. And one of the most important things here is that knowing what to do has never been the same as being able to actually do it. We know from decades of behavior change research that the information on its own doesn't lead to consistent action. If it did, then it would be easy, wouldn't it? We'd never struggle. What actually makes the biggest difference isn't how motivated you're feeling in the morning, it's whether your meals are set up to support that intention. Hunger, tiredness, stress, and our habits all have far more influence on what you eat than good intentions ever will. So when eating feels really, really hard, it's usually not that you lack discipline or willpower. It's more of an issue with how things are set up. So we're going to explore this a little bit further. Now, before becoming a coach and working as a PT, I was a primary school teacher many moons ago. And then before that, before university, in fact, I worked in offices. And over the years, I have sat in many staff rooms and I would see women that I worked with who were on a diet turning up with the tiniest, and I mean the tiniest lunches that they've prepped at home. And they pretty much always look the same. Small salads, rice cakes, maybe a little yogurt or some cut up veg on the side. And they'd manage this for a couple of weeks and then it would all start to unravel. They'd be hungry, they'd be tired, and then that way of eating would feel really, really hard to sustain, which I think is understandable. But obviously they would blame themselves because they're women and they think that they weren't cut out for it. But now working as a coach, there is an interesting overlap because I do have similar conversations now with women through my page or who are signing up for coaching who are very aware of their health and know that they want to get protein with their meals and so on. And they tell me that they are eating really healthily, that they have a high protein breakfast. But when we actually look at what this is looking like, it turns out that the breakfast is some 0% Greek yogurt with some berries on it, or they're having 2 eggs at breakfast, like a 2-egg omelette. Maybe it might have some veg added in or a slice of lean bacon, but really it's just the 2 eggs. And those foods that I've mentioned are great. Obviously, they've all fab. They're healthy choices. They do contain protein. But what I am seeing again and again is this idea that less is more, and it creeps into the choices we're making when we're on a diet. Eating as little as possible feels like the sensible choice. Feeling hungry between meals feels like a sign that you're doing what you need to do. And this definitely isn't coming out of nowhere. We've had years and years of messaging telling us what foods are or aren't healthy without really being told how to structure our meals through the day in a way that is going to support us. So yes, it's easy to see how eating healthily ends up meaning eating very little. Now, this is usually the point where people will say, I know what to eat, I just can't seem to do it. And when someone is saying this, it often gets interpreted by them or someone else as a motivation or a discipline problem. But in reality, it very rarely is. What's usually going on here is hunger. But a little side note on hunger here before I carry on. You see, if fat loss is the goal, it is going to be normal to feel a bit hungry at times. When your energy intake drops from what you're used to eating, your body is going to be paying attention to that. It is going to notice. Appetite can increase and your hunger signals can become more noticeable. This does not mean that you're doing anything wrong. It's just that your body is doing what it's designed to do. But, and it's a big but, there is a big difference between some hunger and excessive hunger. Normal hunger might show up before meals, you feel ready to eat, you enjoy your food, and then you get on with your day. The kind of hunger that then causes problems is the hunger that feels constant, it's distracting, it feels like you're battling your body all day long. And we know from research that excessive hunger undermines adherence, not because you don't care enough, but because when hunger is high, our food thoughts are going to increase. Decision making is going to become harder and willpower has to work far harder than it was ever meant to. And we can only manage that for a limited amount of time. So understandably, this is then when things start to unravel. So you're starting the day with good intentions. You eat what you believe is a healthy breakfast. You keep lunch light. And then by late afternoon or evening, food feels so much harder to manage and snacking can feel out of control. And it might be that you're thinking, fine, I'll just start again tomorrow. Or it might be that snacking came in earlier. You didn't eat enough breakfast, so you snack a bit and then you think, I've snacked, I've eaten more now, so I'm going to skip my lunch and wait until dinner time. And then you just end up snacking all day. And this all gets framed as a personal failing. But if we go back to the meals we've talked about earlier, it does start to make a lot more sense. You see, a 2-egg omelette contains around 12 to 14 grams of protein. Yogurt and fruit might provide around 15 grams of protein, depending on the portion. And often it's only a couple of 100 calories that we're having. So yeah, the meals contain protein, but they're not particularly high in protein. And when we look at the research around appetite and satiety, meals higher in protein are consistently shown to be more satisfying and better at supporting appetite control. But when researchers talk about higher protein meals, they're often looking at something closer to 25 grams of protein or more than that per meal. And this can be quite hard to achieve if you're then trying to keep those meals as small as possible or as few calories as possible. So protein matters, fiber matters, but overall energy matters too. You need enough in those meals with the fuel to do the job that you want. And when meals aren't providing us enough protein, enough fiber, and enough energy, hunger is almost guaranteed to show up later. And then once hunger is high, other things start to amplify it. You see, stress can drive our appetite. Not eating enough can increase the stress on our body. Poor sleep can make hunger even louder and decision-making harder. And these are all quite common at this stage of life as well. And then constantly thinking about what you should or you shouldn't be doing with food can then increase that noise even more and make everything feels harder than it needs to be. And this is how we end up in this vicious cycle. Eating too little leads to hunger. Hunger increases stress, and those thoughts and stress and fatigue make choices harder. And then obviously the conclusion is, well, it's because I just can't stick to anything. But really, the issue isn't that you don't know what to eat. It's that the way that you were eating isn't giving you enough to support what you're doing consistently. And this is where it can be really helpful to kind of zoom out and look at the day as a whole rather than those meals in isolation. How much you're going to be eating in those meals is always going to be individual. A smaller woman, and by smaller, I mean smaller in height, smaller in stature, may genuinely feel fine on less. Someone taller, someone who's more active or training very regularly will usually need more. And it can be helpful to look at proportions here rather than exact numbers. So rather than me telling you that you should be having 500 calories for breakfast, which might be appropriate for one person and not another, we can break it down into what might work as proportion of your calories over the day. Now, a lot of women are going to find that it works well when they eat a decent chunk of their overall calories earlier in the day, rather than just trying to get through on very little and then saving the most for later. So this might look like breakfast and lunch together, providing around half of what you eat in a day, with then dinner and 1 or 2 snacks making up the rest. Again, this is not a rule. You can go by what you feel, but I find that if I have breakfast, that is less than 400 calories, I'm going to feel pretty hungry pretty quickly. And when we're eating enough in the meals and our hunger feels calmer, our snacking does tend to feel more in control. Our food choices become easier to manage. And then the consistency we're craving stops feeling like this constant battle. But there is another very important thing to say here, because the proportions I'm talking about only make sense if the total you're working with makes sense in the first place. A lot of women are trying to split up a calorie target that's already too low for them. I still hear again and again 1,200 calories mentioned all the time. Usually it's because people have heard that it's right for weight loss. Maybe because places like MyFitnessPal will often set that as a baseline and then build onto it. But honestly, for most women, especially those who have some body fat to lose, this is likely to be far too little. And I even see it, and I mentioned this on my last podcast episode, that women will be trying to sustain a calorie intake that's lower than their basal metabolic rate. So our BMR is the amount of energy that your body needs just to keep you alive at rest. That's breathing, circulation, basic bodily functions. So when you're consistently eating below that, it is absolutely no surprise that hunger is going to be very loud, energy is going to be low, and sticking to things feels exhausting. And this is one of the reasons that I use a calorie range rather than a fixed number. A range is going to give you the flexibility because life is not going to be the same every day. It isn't for anyone, but I think particularly in midlife, with our time being spread out between lots of different things, and with energy changes because of hormones. So with a fat loss goal, I would normally encourage people to aim to average somewhere around the middle of their range across the week. And for a lot of women, that might be a number that's closer to 1,600, 1,800 in a deficit, maybe more than this as well. I often have people that are still going to be in a deficit much higher than this. It does depend on your height, your activity levels, your starting weight. And when you look at proportions with a number like that, then things suddenly look very different. Someone eating around 1,800 calories a day might have breakfast and lunch together, making up around half of that. And that's going to be 900 calories across the first part of the day. So instead of trying to get through on 300 calories at breakfast and 300 calories at lunch, you're looking at something like 450 for breakfast and 450 for lunch, if that works for you, with some flexibility, of course. And this doesn't, of course, mean that it needs to look the same every day. For me, on more active days, I'll often feel like I need a little bit more. But on days where I'm sitting down a bit more and I'm doing less, then eating a little bit less is also fine. And this is why the range can matter. It allows you to respond to your life and what's going on and how you're feeling, rather than trying to force yourself into the same number every single day, regardless of what you're doing. And then when our total intake is realistic, and our meals earlier in the day are doing what they need to do, hunger is absolutely going to feel easier to manage, and consistency is going to feel calmer, and that feeling of constantly battling your body starts to ease. Now, next, I want to talk to you a little bit more about the other question that I mentioned at the start, which is I eat really healthily, so why isn't my weight changing? And understandably, this usually comes with genuine confusion, not in a defensive way, because when you're cooking at home and you're choosing whole foods and you're trying to make better choices, you expect that to work. I remember a conversation that I had with a friend. I've definitely mentioned her on a podcast before, but she'd been having a couple of biscuits, maybe 2 or 3 in the afternoon, most days. And she decided that she would cut these out and replace them with something healthier. So she stopped having the biscuits, but she swapped them for nuts, which sounds like a very good, healthy swap on the surface of things, except that she came to me and she couldn't understand why she had gained weight and not lost it. So I actually asked her to show me in my scales. I remember this, which is why it comes up again and again in podcasts, asking her to weigh out with the nuts how much she was having. And it turned out that she was having around 650 calories of nuts as a snack compared to the biscuits that she'd replaced, which were probably closer to 200, maybe 250 calories, like max. I think she was having bourbons. Anyway, it did make complete sense. And it isn't that the nuts were a bad choice. They are nutritious. They're full of healthy fats, but they are far more calorie dense than she realized. And just like the woman I mentioned at the start of this podcast, who cooks at home, who focuses on whole food, who doesn't eat much ultra processed food, and then doesn't understand why the weight won't budge. She had never tracked calories. And understandably, it does feel confusing because you don't need to track calories to lose weight. I will often say that you don't need to track calories to lose weight. But when you're not tracking, foods that are more calorie dense can have a much bigger impact than you realize, especially when they're foods that we've been told are really good for us. And I did experience this myself many years ago. So this was long before I became a PT, and I wanted to lose some weight. And I did paleo because I'd been told that if you ate that way, you'd feel better and you'd lose weight. And for anyone that doesn't know what paleo is, it focuses on minimally processed foods, lots of meat, vegetables, fruit, and healthy fats, but it cuts out things like grains and legumes. And I did well at this for a time. I was cooking from scratch. I was eating whole foods. I had the spiralizer out and I was doing my green beans instead of pasta. And I was having lots of what I thought were healthy fats. And I didn't lose weight. If anything, actually, I gained a bit of weight and I felt pretty rotten as well. Looking back, there are a couple of reasons why I didn't lose weight and I felt pretty rubbish. One was that I was eating a lot more fat than I realized. And the other was that I was running 3 or 4 times a week at the time. Going lower carb while doing that much cardio just was never going to suit my lifestyle or my energy needs. I needed more carbohydrates to support what I was doing. So while the food quality was great, the approach wasn't right for me. And I think this is also an important point to make. All the time, we're told that if we choose minimally processed or whole foods, we don't need to worry about calories and weight loss will just happen. And sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. And it's not because your body is resisting you. It's not because you're doing something wrong, but because foods that are higher in fat are also more calorie dense. And this is where healthy fats come in. Things like nuts, nut butters, avocado, oils, seeds, cheese. These foods are not bad per se. They're important for our health. They help with satisfaction. Like fat is quite a good fuel source, and they can make our meals so much more enjoyable. But they're also very easy to overportion without even realizing it. And even if you're eating whole or healthy foods, total energy intake still matters when fat loss is the goal. And this is where it helps to remember that healthy eating and fat loss overlap, but they're not identical because our food quality matters, but quantity matters too. And over time, your body is going to respond to how much energy you're taking in, not just where it's coming from. And on the flip side, if you were only looking at calories and getting all of your calories from things like chocolate, in theory, you'd still lose weight, but it'd be really hard and you'd feel really shitty doing it because you wouldn't be getting the nutrients you need. So when our weight isn't changing and we feel like we're eating the right foods, it's often because without realizing it, the total amount is just a bit more than our body needs for fat loss right now. When researchers look at long-term health, body composition, and what people can actually stick to, the approaches that consistently come out well aren't extreme. They're not cutting out entire food groups. They're not about eating as little as possible. One pattern of eating that comes up again and again is the Mediterranean style diet. And it is worth saying here that it's not really a diet in the way we tend to think of diets. The word diet originally meant a way of living. And often people hear Mediterranean diet and think they only need to eat foods from the Mediterranean. It's not that at all. It's just a lifestyle and approach that focuses on real, minimally processed foods, plenty of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, protein from things like fish, meat, eggs, and legumes. And it does include fats, but they're not the main event. And here it is those healthy fats like olive oils, nuts, seeds, and cheese. They're there to add flavor and enjoyment and satisfaction, not to dominate the plate or not to dominate our snacking. And the nice thing about the Mediterranean diet is it goes hand in hand with other lifestyle factors, regular movement, eating with others, enjoying food rather than micromanaging it, and having those more indulgent foods in a less often but more enjoyable way. It absolutely isn't about perfection. It's about something you can live with. But again, what this style of eating doesn't tell you is how to structure your meals across the day or how to think about portions in a practical day-to-day way. And as well as looking at the proportions we spoke about earlier, this is where volume can become very important. Because it's not just about the calories or even the protein and the fiber in isolation. I'm sorry if this feels like it's becoming this bigger thing, But if most of our meals are made up of calorie-dense foods, even if they're healthy, the portion can end up looking like tiny. And one of the things that really helps with satisfaction is volume. And when I talk about volume, I'm talking about foods that are lower in calories per gram. Often these have a higher water content, but it's foods that allow you to build a plate that looks great and feels generous. So instead of trying to eat tiny portions of everything, you're thinking about layering your meals. Think about a base of vegetables or other low energy foods, an adequate, decent protein source, and then some healthy fats added with intention rather than accidentally. So you would be looking at perhaps measuring these if you have a fat loss goal. And this combination of food tends to feel pretty complete, it's pretty satisfying, and it doesn't rely on willpower. And I know that in the summer, it can be very easy to picture that type of thing with big salads, lots of vegetables, a decent protein source, maybe some grains, add a bit of olive oil as a dressing or a bit of cheese for flavor, and bish, bash, bosh, you're done. But it also works in these colder months as well. Stews, soups, casseroles, one-pot dishes, bulk them up with vegetables, with beans or with pulses, making the portion feel generous. And then add the protein and some fats for richness and enjoyment. One of my lovely members likes to choose vegetarian recipes that are full of veg and then add a protein source to those. And that's a great way of doing it. I do something similar but different, as in I'll take recipes that perhaps don't always have loads and loads of volume, and I will add veg to them or add veg on the side as well. So with my bolognese, and you can't even see it, oh great, loads of courgette into it. I call it covert veg. And you can't taste it once it's been cooked long enough, but it does add the volume. And with my boys being such big eaters, we'll often cook up some frozen broccoli or frozen veg of some description. And whatever we're having as a main meal, we will have a decent sized portion of that on the side. And actually that tends to be the thing that they reach for first because they do like it, but it also makes the plate look more satisfying. And there's a whole body of research around energy density and something called volumetrics that does show people tend to eat less overall without trying when our meals are higher in volume, not because they're restricting, but because they feel more satisfied. And this is where a lot of people start to have a real change. When meals start to feel bigger rather than smaller, then eating well feels calmer. Hunger is definitely easier to manage, and fat loss stops feeling like it's something you have to force. And this is where awareness is going to come in. And I want to be very clear here because I do think this can get misunderstood. I said it earlier and I say it again. You do not need to track calories in order to lose fat. Plenty of people don't. But having an awareness of how much you're eating, especially if you do have a fat loss goal, is incredibly helpful. Awareness is going to give you that clarity. And then that clarity is going to make everything easier. And for some people, that awareness might come from tracking for just a short period of time, not forever, not in an obsessive way, just as a learning and a curiosity phase, a way of seeing how your meals actually add up rather than guesswork. And for others, it might simply be having a better sense of the calories in those more energy dense foods, things like the oils and nut butters and cheese, etc., that we've mentioned. Foods that are healthy but easy to overportion without realizing. None of this is about control. This is all about understanding. When we have this awareness, we can start seeing the patterns. And you might notice that on days when breakfast is a bit smaller, your hunger is louder later on. And another thing I hear all the time with people who will say, stress has been higher at work, I'm just an emotional eater, is that when stress is higher at work, they don't even realize it, but they're eating on the fly. They might skip meals. And then the hunger they're experiencing later is more as a reaction to what fuel they've had earlier in the day. Obviously, stress can drive hunger, but it's not going to be helped if that stress has then led to us not having what we need in our meals. And that's something else that we can notice by being a bit more aware. And it might be that you also notice that certain foods are tipping your intake a little bit higher than you realize. And again, instead of that leading to us beating ourselves up and feeling annoyed, it's more about curiosity. This is starting to make sense now because you can't change the past. It's happened. But you can change how you feel about it, which I think is interesting, and how you make sense of it, and then make a plan going forward. And you can say to yourself, no wonder that was hard. And there's so much research showing that self-monitoring is linked to better outcomes when it comes to behavior change. and in particular fat loss. It's not forcing us to be perfect, but it's because feedback is going to help us adjust. There is no failure, only feedback. Say it again and again, but we need to use it kindly. We need to use it as information and not judgment. It allows you to say, oh, I understand what's been happening to me, and now I know what I can do to help. This is very different to constantly blaming yourself or assuming that you're doing something wrong. Awareness should not make things feel harder, even if you have those moments where you're like, I should know better. We want to use it well, and we want it to then make things feel calmer. Because when we do understand what's going on, we're taking away that guesswork and you're making intentional choices. And actually, if there's one thing I can have you taking away from this episode, if nothing else, is that if you're struggling with any of these things, be curious. It's not about just trying harder, working harder, adding on more. Use that curiosity. Curious about what your day actually looks like. Curious about how your meals are supporting you. Curious about whether the way you've been taught a diet should feel is actually helping or holding you back. Because a lot of us are still carrying these old beliefs that fat loss should feel really uncomfortable and hard, that being very hungry is a sign that you're doing it right, that eating less is always better. And sometimes the most helpful thing we can do is question our beliefs, to ask whether they're serving us now and whether we are ready to trust the process a little more, to accept that sometimes eating more at the right time is exactly what allows things to feel calmer and more sustainable and ultimately more effective. It's not about being perfect. It's about support. And I will hear women say so many times that they are now eating more and losing weight, and they're not eating more calories, but they're eating in a way that feels like more volume, more at their meals. And this feels good. And this makes everything else feel easier. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode, do make sure that you're following or that you've subscribed so you don't miss out on the next one. And if you want some support putting this into practice, then come and join us inside the Ruth McFit app. This is where we focus on building strength, confidence, and consistency in a way that feels good and that fits your life. All the links will be in the show notes.